Thank you very much, Bruce. It's a delight for me to be seeing some old friends in the audience and to discuss this book that I just MIT Press released in October. So it's really fresh out there. And what I want to do is the book covers expansively. It is overly ambitious, but I want to walk you through parts of it. There's a history that everybody should read because it helps to understand. However, what I want to do in the time that we have here, and I want to have some time for questions and answers as well, is to take you through the present, where we are now, and then walk you through the development of a national strategy for modernizing the grid end to end. So with that, let's define a bit what we're talking about. And most of the overall electricity system, this expresses it pretty well. Central station, steam generation, step up for transmission, step down for getting into the distribution network, and then off of the distribution network, a variety of customers. So first of all, who are the providers? Well, you can see there that almost 70% are investor-owned utilities, and those utilities, it's been a large consolidation in, so that the utilities are now grouped primarily together into holding companies, 52 holding companies, and then a few others held a different way. But the remainder is public power, publicly, municipally owned, about 15% in cooperatives, and both in large numbers, and federal power marketers. Now, what I like to express, the students that are in the audience, I would really encourage you that get out of the classroom, get on the road, and kick the tires on the existing infrastructure and talk to the folks that operate the existing infrastructure. And here is a 1955 coal-fired power plant, and it's a 1,400 megawatts of capacity. It consumes 140 railroad cars a day of coal. Here's a 2003 vintage combined cycle natural gas plant, and that's about 770 megawatts of power generation. Now we're off onto the non-carbon resources, and here is the Grand Coulee Dam, the largest dam in the US, and it's the 6th largest dam in the world, 7,700 megawatts of capacity. And here's a favorite with Californians, Diablo Canyon. It's the power reactor that everybody loves to hate, and that is has been operating very well. It is going to be phased out of the California energy mix in 2024 and 25 when their current operating licenses expire. Here we have a 20 megawatt wind farm and 2.5 megawatts per windmill. And there we have a 4 megawatt installation of solar panels. So in terms of who owns all this, again, the investor-owned utilities own about not quite 40%, and more than 40% is owned by independent power generators. And this is the result of federal enactment of, in 1992, of the wholesale power generation. In fact, it came in 1989. We started to get there earlier. But the federal law authorized states to mandate that utilities divest themselves of portions of their generation. And that became the beginnings of what from then on was expanded as independently owned generation. And so there are numbers of companies that are very large generators, independent and privately owned. And the balance comes, as far as ownership comes, from publicly owned utilities, cooperatives, and federal marketing agents. Now, as far as the fuels that are used in this existing generation fleet, it's pretty evenly divided, coal and natural gas. Formerly, there was 50% coal and 22% natural gas, but there's been an decline in coal and an expansion of gas in the system. The nuclear fraction is quite stable as the hydro, and you see here where wind and solar has expanded to a 7% slice, which is small. However, it's been, the last few years, the most rapidly wind and solar together account for the largest increment of capacity of generation in the US system. Now, if you take greenhouse gas emissions, which I'm concerned with, and I hope all of you, the electricity sector is the largest sector in the American economy contributing greenhouse gas emissions. And within the electricity sector, coal accounts for 70% and natural gas for 30%. So that gas is a cleaner burning fuel as far as emissions of CO2. Now let's switch over to transmission and who owns that. The investor-owned utilities own about 2/3, and the remaining, but for 4% that are an IPP, independently owned transmission company, 4% independent, and the rest is the federal power agencies, cooperatives, and the public sector. So America is divided into 3 major interconnections. East, about 750,000 megawatts, west about 125,000, and Texas about 95,000 megawatts. Texas, incidentally, is, as Texas will be, having their own ERCOT, which they escape a good deal of federal regulation by insisting on that. Now, beyond or closer in the federal, there are 66 balancing authorities that are single points of control for systems with their own footprints. And there are 66 of those, 38 in the West. But that they really dynamically manage and keep the lights on within their control areas. Of the 66, 7 are in the form of independent system operators, sometimes called regional transmission organizations, and they operate competitive wholesale power markets, and also they have participating transmission owners that provide the power flows, and they then have load-serving entities, utilities, that deal with the retail markets. So you have these various layers, and here is an example of a control room. I picked out my favorite, the California Independent System Operator, which is, I think, one of the most advanced in the world. It's a new one that was built on my watch there, and it distinguishes itself because it can manage on a separate desk the rapidly increasing solar and wind that is within the California ISO footprint. So let's then turn to the policy oversight. And I apologize for the complexity of all this, but it is a hodgepodge, no doubt about it. And it's built around the concept of 50 state laboratories. So you have a lot of concurrent jurisdiction between the federal government and the state governments. And then the local accounts for the public power, where the cities control their own destiny in policy terms. But you can see there at the top, for example, electricity infrastructure. This feds enable the states in that case. But of course, there's a split between wholesale rates and retail rates, and so on down the list. As far as the expansion of renewable energy, solar and wind in America, it has been driven by the states, not the federal government, in the form of renewable portfolio standards, which means that by X year, you will have Y % of your load served by renewable energy. And in California's case, that means 50% by 2030. So why a national strategy? Well, first of all, the infrastructure, parts of it are aging, and they're going to need replacement. And in my view, it should be a national project stretching over at least 2 decades, and it will involve investing productively trillions of dollars. Within that frame, there are 2 major threats. I use the word here, opportunities. You can, if you want to look at it that way. One is coping and keeping the bad guys out, cyber attacks, and it's recognized that the infrastructure is vulnerable in many respects, many entryways to being seriously disrupted by cyber attacks. And overarching is also climate change, and how do we come to terms with the fact that we are at serious risk of overheating the planet. So one way to look at it is to think in terms of four major groupings of things. I'll start with the 12 o'clock, and reliability and resilience paired. We must maintain continuous, and the digital economy and all the things that are happening inside the economy demand more and more reliability continuously. And the resilience comes in for the fact we had extreme weather events, and they are going to be happening. It's the new normal as far as the overall infrastructure is concerned, and we need to iron up. Next, environmentally sustainable, long-term. Of course, global warming is a huge environmental issue. I would group in that really effective health and safety regulation of every step of the with the infrastructure as a whole. And modernization requires that we have interoperable systems, operating systems, that really combine advanced information technology and communications to automate a good deal of operations beyond, for example, the control room at CAISO, but also very much so within our distribution networks. And, oh, by the way, we need to keep the prices affordable and yet assure that the prices are high enough so that the revenues that are generated will attract the kind of financing that we need, debt and equity, in order to create the infrastructure. So governance is, in my view, balancing between those four major divisions. And in terms of talking with you through forming a national strategy, what I prefer to do is what the utilities right now are doing, which is really getting engaged with their customers to how do we do this going down the road. So I will start inverting this where we started and start with the customers and work my way through the distribution network, transmission, and then back to generation. And retail consumers, it's obvious, and Jim is a great expert in this, that we need to mine out of our existing infrastructure all of the energy efficiency improvements that are cost effective. Now, there are lots of obstacles to achieving that, but nevertheless, that must be an objective. The cheapest and the most environmentally clean energy resource we have, energy efficiency. Now, two questions. Should the IOU industry, should the state mandate that retail competition from other suppliers should be enabled. Several states have done this: Texas, Ohio, New York, and Illinois. And the question is that a good thing for everybody? And I think that we ought to measure very carefully the results in these other states and not rush into competitive suppliers muscling out by competing with the utility that provides the retail. So the other question, and it's very pregnant in California, should states generally adopt legislation that California has on community choice aggregation, which is basically public power takes over not the delivery system, not even customer billing, but just takes over the consumer retail in a geographic area. And what do? They buy power wholesale. Sometimes Shell Oil Company is the provider out of the wholesale market, and they green it up with renewable energy credits. That's one way. I think if you're going that route, that you ought to actually insist on the community choice aggregator to create additional solar, and it's really all about solar within their geography, which means that they're not going to get into it unless they have a good credit rating to finance the bonds for that. Now, distributed energy resources, that's a very broad term. It includes energy efficiency, which we talked about. It also includes demand response, whereby consumers can actually, by Amory Lovin's famous negawatts, they can reduce their demand, and it's equivalent to a bit of supply. And that is being nicely compensated for within the wholesale power market. And so that it should be, and hopefully will be, expanded rapidly. But it's terrific in PJM, not so much in California. But basically, I believe that utilities should serve, that is, transmission and distribution utilities should serve as the platforms for mobilizing and integrating this whole menu of distributed energy resources, including solar and photovoltaics on rooftops now, not industrial scale deployments, within the distribution networks. And we will see how this goes, and California is one of the real demonstrators. There are a lot of projects going that loop energy storage along with other the solar and other innovations within the distribution network. So now moving up to transmission. There are two areas in America that are where expansion of the grid is very much in order. One is on the East Coast, where offshore wind is finally getting started after a lot of long-term fits and starts, is being very promising to expand offshore wind and bring that into the transmission systems that are on land. The other is in the Western interconnection. And the solar and wind resource in the Western interconnection is enormous and needs to be brought to markets by a combination of AC and DC lines. And that's a major project. And if that occurs, in order for it to occur, I believe we need to expand the California Independent System Operator, and they're doing a bit of this in a slice of the market, but to expand that into the rest of the West. And then to enable that, Governor Brown has to come through and persuade the legislature to change the governance of the California Independent System Operator to include on its board the other states. But if that doesn't happen, I mean, California is pretty insular in itself, and it really, if we're going down the road for deep carbonization of our electricity system, let's get off it and get into this where everybody wins by broadening out into the rest of the West, and this great project for the Lane Center to sink its teeth into. Now I'm focusing on advanced generation. Here is an example of what's called IGCC plus CCS, integrated gasification combined cycle with carbon capture and sequestration. And this is Southern Company's $7 billion gamble with being able to develop a plant, and this project received a lot of Department of Energy support up to a point. And as you can see, that it's at this point it's shut down. They got so far as where they have got a bit of natural gas combined cycle that is operating on the site, but this is pretty well dead at this point, although the cost recovery is well in dispute. There are a couple of other of these projects still around, and two of them, well, the two major ones are in Texas. And both of those are coming to a halt, I believe. And well, I'll come back to that a little bit later because I have a thought about that. So here is nuclear expansion. And this is the Southern Company. And it's the Vogtle plant in Georgia. And that is to advanced design of AP1000 reactors, and they are off of their schedule and over their budget significantly. And Westinghouse, that had the contract, is bankrupt, and Westinghouse, as you all know, is a subsidiary of Toshiba, the Japanese company, and I think Toshiba is in itself on the not very healthy as a result of this. So that project is looking as though it's certainly at best just halted. So then, where are we with generation going forward? In my view, going back to coal and nuclear, I would say that America, through the DOE, should, they have this they had a clean power initiative that gave support to these projects for cleaning up coal. And I suggest that we get with the Chinese and form a cooperative for demonstration, further demonstration projects that would demonstrate integration of gasification of coal and combined cycle and obviously disposal of carbon capture and disposal. But it's too much for us, and of course we need to be phasing out, continuing the phase out. But I think there's a global issue that it would be really helpful, and if we could get the Germans to come in on that with us and multinationalize the framework for demonstration projects, that's worth pursuing. As far as the nuclear goes, I think that the DOE should cooperate with the US nuclear industry in demonstration projects of what are called small modular reactors. Reactors that are sub 300 megawatts. There's one project that's in nuclear NRC licensing at this point, but there are a variety of worthy types of configuration of reactors that I think we should press ahead with for what happens if small modular is deployed in America. First of all, it's economies of scale through manufacturing, and it is building into a overall electricity system where the demand for electricity is not expanding very rapidly. Cyber. We need to have the interoperability standards and cybersecurity standards need to be, they are intertwined because interoperability creates more problems for protection. What has happened, however, is that there is standards on the cyber for the bulk power system, but not for the distribution systems. And here, President Trump, you should work with Congress and realize that the national security is definitely involved and develop cyber standards that will apply throughout the electricity infrastructure. And one of the suggestions, of course, is encryption. And there's a lot of work, I understand, that is quite advanced that could, if enabled. Now, the costs are going to go up, and that is going to be a big problem, especially if you're going to universalize these requirements, and how are the rural co-ops going to pay for cyber protection? And how's everybody going to pay for this? I don't have an answer to that, but I do have a strong opinion that we need to work and work hard and create effective standards. Lastly, climate change. COP21, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, we came together, 193 countries led by America and China, and achieved a commitment to work toward aggressively limiting the heating the global temperature rise to 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. That agreement was applauded by everybody until. And President Trump did walk us back and decided to withdraw from that agreement. And that will take us until November of 2020 to complete. That is the end of President Trump's first term. So there we are. However, at the Paris Bond Agreement, COP23, which was held earlier last month, early November, everybody was there, all the countries were there, they were on the same sheet of music, they're learning better about how to implement and so forth, except for the United States. And our presentation, to the extent that there was any government presentation made there by the oil and gas industry, was actually protested. However, states and cities and businesses are in the "we are still in" camp. And Governor Brown, our governor here in California, is really leading this charge to make sure that the rest of the world understands that the federal government has disconnected itself in this sense from the endeavor. So let's just keep pushing. And from my point of view, just if I can, in conclusion, so between now and 2050, after President Trump's first term, 8 presidential elections after his first term. Ladies and gentlemen, we need a bipartisan, durable effort as part of this, the crucial part of this national strategy to get us down the road of decarbonizing the electricity system over this long term. Now, bipartisan, for between now and it's going to last for 8 presidential elections. We've done it before. In 1946, Churchill gave his famous Iron Curtain speech, Fulton, Missouri. It came down in 1946. In 1992, the Soviet flag came down, in 1992. Did I correct myself? 1992. The Soviet flag came down in Moscow. Between that time, 46 and 92, America had a contentious, however, bipartisan defense and foreign policy. So we've done it before. So it's time to start again. Thank you very much. And questions, please. Have I used up all the time? I hope I got
No,
one
no,
more.
you haven't. I'll start off with a question, yeah. So I buy the idea that we'd like to have a national policy in the end, but as a political scientist, getting from here to there looks to me like a very formidable problem.
Yeah.
So is there an intermediate strategy between, our very, very fractured energy system and something that's maybe sub-regional in rational ways that would be the step forward? Because right now I just don't see, even if you were to change the administration, you've got deeper problems across the country in terms of the fracture, right? You've got states that really are committed to their fossil industries, et cetera. So what's our intermediate strategy? If we grant you that we want to get to a national energy policy, but how do we get there in steps that takes into account the political fracture we have?
That's the 50 state laboratories, and they are all, they are on frequently not the same sheet of music. And if you look at what had been going, and there's still momentum, my belief is that there's a lot of coal that's still being retired so that we could almost make the Obama, I think it was 32% below reduction in carbon emissions out of the electricity infrastructure with the clean power plan. Now that gets us out to 2030, but there, it does, it requires and in the book I have proposals for cross-cutting innovations, and one of them is that we need to share the experience of long-term resource planning and cooperating with things like the National NARUC, the National Association of Regulatory Commissioners, and get onto a mode of learning. And of course, California and New York and Massachusetts are really on the cutting edge, and other parts of the country don't follow this. And Southern Company, of course, is a classic example in the South. And they're still tightly integrated, generation, transmission, distribution, and so forth. Well, but if you can get state policies and propagate, and the old McKinsey best practices. Now I know I'm a little bit idealistic. On the other hand, I've always been that way, and so I don't think that we should be discouraged. But we do have to recognize these barriers and really go after them. But there's so much sense that can be made in terms of the regionalization of these problems and the benefits that flow from larger regions getting together. And it's on the East Coast, of course, there is, for example, RIGI, the outfit that is doing carbon trading on the East Coast, just the way California is doing it on the West Coast, and these institutions. But yeah, I mean, it's not easy, but I don't want the young people here to be discouraged about it. Because this is work, this is your future. Yeah, I've got a few grandchildren. I didn't throw that at you. But I have 8 grandchildren. They range from 53, they will range from 53 to 43 in 2050. Now go figure. I mean, where are, everybody ought to get these kinds of things in their head. because otherwise we are really headed for a very overheated planet. And that, I don't mind being idealistic about wanting to keep it cool.
Okay. Yes.
So I have a question. Let's premise that it succeeds and the dream is achieved and no more carbon. In other words, the assault on the atmosphere is stopped. What is your vision or your picture of the end point of this grid infrastructure? What it finally becomes when this is achieved?
Well, I mean, there are much longer, for example, plasma physics can get us to controlled fusion and all kinds of other things that are being worked on that I didn't talk about that are very much in the research and development. And this is where Stanford comes in because they're gonna solve these problems. I just went to Berkeley, but Berkeley's got some pretty good engineers too. And frankly, where I don't have the vision of an end game, and I don't think there ever will be that kind of vision. But I do have a vision for finding pathways around which we can enable innovation to occur within this electricity infrastructure. So I'm just trying to get us moving down the road toward 2050, and I'm not going to be around then. So it's up to the young people in the room to keep it going and maybe changing course. But what I can't imagine is that it's a very comfortable future when the planet is overheated.
In the back.
What are the major corporations that are interested and therefore this progressive like updating of the energy infrastructure and those that are trying to maintain the current system?
The major corporations, the private sector companies. Well, the manufacturers of wind and solar certainly, and I'm going to depress you further because the tax law really screws up the financing of additional solar and wind projects. So maybe they'll be able to fix that before they pass it, but the current versions, either House or Senate, they threw a monkey wrench into the incentives of investment tax credit. Now, companies, you've got a host of vendors of wind turbines, a host of vendors of solar modules, and it's a globalized industry. Lots of European companies, lots of Asian companies, and so forth. So that the winners still have to be determined. But what's interesting about it is that the implementers the majority of the implementers should be the investor-owned utilities that everybody loves to hate. And so, but they are really wrestling, all of them, and they're actually quite aware of the cybersecurity risks and working hard on that. But the equipment vendors, coupled with the utilities, it's not. Well, I hesitate to single out any particular company that's going to be a winner in this. I look for a diversity of suppliers and a diversity of resources that are non-carbon.
That's right.
What is your vision for how to smooth out the energy cycle, which is currently like about 2 to 1 between, on a daily basis, so that generation can proceed efficiently and you don't overload transmission?
Yeah, and CAISO is really cutting edge on this. And one is storage. And of course, there's a lot of competition for storage, and the lithium ion battery, and Elon Musk is a real pro with the lithium ion battery. But I think that if you sampled, I'm sure that Stanford researchers would have a variety of other kinds of storage batteries that would have advantages and disadvantages, not just lithium ion. I would hate to see, although there are a lot of articles about how well they really are on their way to monopolizing the storage industry. But so storage is clear. I think that in addition to storage, there's going to continue to be a role for peaker gas-fired peakers to give an additional assurance to balance this out. Now, a big gain can occur if you step into the rest of the West as far as solar and wind is concerned, because then you diversify when you're going over peaks and into valleys, and you spread that out over time zones and over geographies. So that is one of the main reasons why I'm really so eager to see expansion into the rest of the West. So that's about it.
I happen to believe that mini grids can play an important role as far as undeveloped countries are concerned. But when you talk about our present system not being reliable, I want to know if you envision any role that mini grids can play to make it more reliable.
Glad you said that. They call them microgrids in the industry. And of course, Stanford thought it had a microgrid, I think, at one point, and maybe they do. But what you're talking about is a very, I think, interesting possibility. And universities are one of the major targets for forming a microgrid. And what that would be is that, and I know one firm that is coming into not Stanford, but universities elsewhere, and bidding in for the supply to modernize the whole university framework in the form of a microgrid. And actually, UC San Diego has one, 42 megawatts, that is in potential operation. They're not actually interacting real time, sadly, with the CAISO, with a microgrid. However, what needs to be thought about is that the microgrid, in terms of islanding, as a reliability, so if something goes out, hey, I'm in an island, bang. And the only thing that I would be cautionary about is that you better have a protocol with the rest of the system so that your islanding doesn't cause problems elsewhere to spread because you've yanked. It's like losing a generator, except in this case you're, taking load off, but you got to be really careful. So that I think that microgrids do have a future, but they got to be really thoughtfully. Now, if you go overseas, that is another. And I just had a debate with a person the other day about microgrids in Africa or developing countries, India, microgrids for village scale power systems. And then, of course, solar is, there it is. And there is quite a bit of that going on. But there is an argument to be made that yes, you can do that, and that gives charging for cell phones and a bit of TV and a bit of light for reading with, and on village scale. Yes, I like that. My friend thinks that yes, sort of, but think ahead, and you're going to need a more significant transmission network to provide larger volumes down the road. But village power is an interesting, and it's being tried. Yeah.
Okay, we have time for just a couple more questions. So here and there, okay? So let's go back there and then.
I'm a professor from Denmark. I'm visiting here and I work with 100% renewable energy systems and energy systems modeling. So I'd just like to, I think it's really nice speech that you made, and also encourage you a bit that I've just been to Bonn and to the COP23, and I actually think things are moving as expected, although Trump made this decision. So I'm not suspecting that this can hold things back. There's really a lot of momentum. And I would also like to say that because you have this national strategy, and I think that's really important, but I would say if it's not going to work, don't be too frustrated. Because what we see in the modeling side is that actually a lot of these things have to be solved, distributed. Large storages have to be local to use large local resources for renewables. And this brings me to my question, because instead of looking at interconnections between the states, have you looked at interconnections between the different sectors? So we have a very large heating demand, cooling demand. In Denmark we have something we call district heating, thermal grids. And if you look at a Tesla battery for a household, that is probably 1,000 times more expensive than thermal storage is. So I think, have you considered this? What kind of thoughts do you have about using storages outside the electricity grid?
Yeah, district heating is, I confess I did not include it in my book to the extent that I should have. In fact, I confess I don't think I mentioned it, but you're absolutely right that district heating is a very interesting add-on, and more than an add-on, but a good foundation for heating, and there are cooling advantages with district heating as well. And so you're ahead of us. There are, on the East Coast, there's several, that's more district heating is going on. San Francisco had a bit of district heating at one point, phased it out. But of course, Denmark, you are fortunate that you got Norway up there as a source of hydro carbon-free hydro that can really enable high penetration of carbon-free energy for Denmark. I'm envious.
We do have Canada. So we're, last question, because we want to allow some time for you to sell some books.
I'm relaxed. I love talking to whoever wants to stay and converse, but
I think a big concern in the West here is the safety of the transmission lines. And they've caused several wildfires. One nearly destroyed the North Bay. I think everyone's going to be very NIMBY about wanting power lines in their area, or new transmission lines in their area because of these big fires. Something has got to be done on that level on a massive scale, just cutting and trimming trees in the path and taking care of that.
there's you're right, and there have been some very good articles in the Chronicle by David Baker about the situation in Napa, Sonoma County, and the fact that PG&E on their, and this is not high voltage transmission that's involved, it's the distribution lines that were where the outages occurred, and they have these closers that would automated closers that would, if the line is cut, they would try a couple of times to pulse to make sure that it was cut, and then it would go off. And that, in retrospect, it certainly complies with all the standards that were around on the building side when they were installed. It was kind of an advanced way of enhancing reliability, but they didn't think about all the wind that was going to come in and blow the trees right across these lines, and the sparking that might have occurred that could cause the fires because of these closers that would try to give it a jolt just to see before they, 2 strikes and you're out. So, but the other point about fires, it's well known that development occurs in areas that are remote and where there are risks of significant fires, and this is endemic to California, but also the rest of the West. And part of the solution is much better, don't let people build if you're going to be, and you're going to want to have electricity. If you want to go off the grid, it's a great place to go off the grid. But if you want to have reliable electricity, we need better land development controls. And actually, there is a statute, I think it's 245, that really does start toward more intelligent land use development. But right now, there's a lot to be exposed out there. And what I would recommend is that what the southern utilities discovered was, hey, don't operate those closers during fire season. And PG&E was a bit slow off the mark on that. But as I say, the real cause of the problem was the very high wind, and it wasn't that's where the cause came from.
Okay, well, thank you very much for this session. And
Thank you all.